Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. Hi everyone. Today on the History with Jackson podcast, we are talking to co-author of The Bright Ages, David M. Perry. We've got an absolutely fantastic podcast topic lined up for you guys today, and this is a truly tremendous book, which I think you guys are going to enjoy learning about and listening to David talk to us and teach us about the various topics within this book. So, David, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm David Perry, author of The Bright Ages, a journalist and historian, and just thrilled to be here.
No, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast, David. Firstly, I just want to introduce the book to everyone. It is The Bright Ages, a new history of medieval Europe. So, guys, in case you haven't seen this all over Twitter, it is an absolutely fantastic book. You know, I think it's very well written. It's very easy to read, and it's really changed my perspective on some of the topics of medieval Europe and looked at them from a different light. So, firstly, David, why did you and your co-author Matthew decide to write this book, and how did you decide upon the title, The Bright Ages?
Yeah, so there's a story we've been telling, and like the best stories, this one I just want to assure everyone happens to be true. Matthew, so Matt and I had known each other since, well over a decade as fellow historians. We enjoyed, we saw each other at conferences. We had meals together. We argued about sports. I know this is in the UK. We're baseball fans, and he's a Yankees fan, and I'm a Red Sox fan. So it's a fairly intense sports rivalry. We had a very good friendship going, and both doing some public writing, and we had talked loosely about collaborating with each other. We wrote an op-ed together that was it was a seamless writing process. The actual mechanics of putting sentences down and enjoying working together was very easy, and that was great. But then what happened was Matt actually went to London and went to the British Museum, which in I guess it would have been late 2018, early 2019, had an exhibit, the British Library. I always say the wrong thing. It's the British Library. They had an exhibit on the treasures of Anglo-Saxon England. And it was this outstanding exhibition on manuscripts, not just from the UK, but from all over Europe, but that were from this period in early England. And it was filled with gold and color and light and sort of, the ways in which this early period in England was connected to the bigger world. And it was an outstanding exhibit. And then Matt, as he tells it, went into the gift shop. And this is how, museums and libraries work, is they have an exhibit, then they try to sell you things. And in the gift shop, of course, the library, they had books, and they had plenty of books on aspects of the Middle Ages, many of which were aimed at public audiences and are quite good. Matt and I always like to say that we're working in a community of scholars doing lots of work. But the general histories of medieval Europe were pretty bad. Either they were old, decades sometimes out of date. I mean, there's a book from the 60s by Norman Cantor. It's a problematic book in some ways, but he at least was a good scholar. But we've just learned a lot from this since the 60s, as you might expect. And it's still a very well-selling book. It's actually our same publisher, so maybe I shouldn't badmouth it too much, but it's just out of date. But a lot of the books are actually very bad. That the whole Middle Ages are just sort of battles and men hitting each other with sticks and so it's just not the period that we recognized. Anyway, so Matt, but as he tells it, he pulled out his phone and he texted me from sort of late afternoon in London and said, "David, I'm at this exhibit. All these books are terrible. We should write one." And I remember in the morning receiving this text and responding more or less right away, because we're both online constantly, and saying, "That's right. And we should call it The Bright Ages." And so at that moment, we were launched. Now that's the story. Why The Bright Ages? We wanted from the jump, from the very first moment you see the book or know that it exists, for people to understand that we're trying to do something different. We're not just trying to tell a more nuanced story about medieval European history, although we are. We're not just trying to tell an engaging and well-written story, although we are, and we hope we do. We're trying to go right at this myth of the Dark Ages, this myth that has been around in some ways since the late 14th century. 600, 700 years is a long time for a myth to last. and say we're not going to accept it. We're not going to nuance it. We're not going to just take the Dark Ages concept and shrink it down. We're going to flip it. We're going to go at it from an entirely different direction, and not say that the Middle Ages were bright and shiny and happy, but that they were knowable. Brightness in the sense of illuminated. Fire is bright. Gold is bright. That we can see the bright ages and understand it.
And I can feel that come across in your writing. I can see that just come through in every single page, where it's not the idea of the Dark Ages, it is the Bright Ages, and you bring that color from the medieval period in so nicely, to the extent that it has changed my perspective on the era. But you've touched on the idea of illumination. I would like to go into that a little bit deeper and say, what is the difference between the Bright Ages and this myth, this traditional view of the Dark Ages?
So you have to sort of know the history of the Dark Ages a little bit. It starts with this idea of kind of barbarism and savagery, and nobody who can read, and the people who can read are all fanatical monks who are not interested in actually learning things, and that myth still is out there. It's 100% still out there, but at least we've pushed back on that a little bit. But there's still kind of, so there's two Dark Ages. So the Dark Age of barbarism and savagery, and that life was brutal and short. Or there's a book called A World Lit Only by Fire by a pretty good biographer of Winston Churchill, who decided to write this terrible book on the Middle Ages that sold hundreds of thousands, I think, of copies. So it's influential, right? This savage medieval world. And it's not that the medieval world didn't have savagery. It's just, I would encourage you to look at, let's say, Ukraine, and tell me that the medieval world was more savage than things that are happening today, or to look at the Thucydides and the wars of ancient Greece and tell me that, the slaughter of all the men of a city is a less savage world than the world of the Middle Ages. History is savage. But one of the ways in which we've pushed back the Dark Ages, and I mean professional historians, is to try to shift it from savagery to unknowability, that there are periods in which we just don't have a lot of sources. We don't really know what's going on. And then it shrinks even further to say, well, we're not really talking about the whole European Middle Ages, let's say 450 to 1450. We're really just talking about a couple centuries in the early part, and maybe only in a few places like England, where we really don't have sources. And there are periods in which there are more sources and periods in which there are less sources. But at all times, the past is knowable. There are things we can know about it. There are things we can learn about it. There are new sources. There's new ways we can collaborate across disciplines. So using science, using archaeology, and also scientists talking to people who read texts, who know Latin, but collaborations and just new forms of understanding of old material as well, that we can read with a different set of knowledge bases. So that's really, we want to push back at the notion that the Middle Ages are somehow terminally backwards and benighted and more savage than other periods, without trying to recuperate it and say, no, everything was great. It was heroic and perfect, because that's also a problematic narrative that also exists out there. But also just to really point out that these were humans. They were capable of all the things humans are capable of, good and bad, and that we can see that humanity in the sources that are left to us. Sometimes more so, sometimes less so. Sometimes you have to read a source kind of sideways in order to get into, to answer questions that the authors weren't interested in answering. Both Matt and I have done a lot of work with the sources around the lives of saints, and those sources show up in our book because they often have everyday life or models of everyday life that show up in trying to illuminate how a particular figure was a saint. And so those sources come down to us, but you can't just read them simply. You have to read them with complexity. And again, we try to make that clear. So that's really the approach from the start, from the very first page, is to say it was knowable, we can see it. They were humans who lived in color. And once we understand that as our baseline, we can start to tell a better story.
And I really like the fact that you're pushing against that notion. You're taking that role of a historian as addressing misconceptions through working with different disciplines, which is something that we as historians have not done very well in the past few years. And it's really exciting to see that you're going into that that method to break down history and bring this history and make it more accessible for everyone. He touched on the age of barbarism, and that kind of brings upon this Dark Ages. But at the start of your book, we look at Rome, and we start with
Yeah.
Rome. So why is Rome so important to this understanding of the Bright Ages?
So the story, the whole notion of the Middle Ages, which is developed, as a middle period between one thing and another, right? It's the only time period in some ways that is defined as not being one thing or another, right? That's between. We don't really have another moment that fits that way in kind of our big periods of history. The people who really kicked off this narrative of the Dark Ages and this middle period of darkness were in the Renaissance, and they were talking about the Roman Empire and lamenting the fall of the Roman Empire. And so again, we have to address that from the start, and we have to talk about ways in which to rethink this 5th century period. And we go about it from a couple different ways. First of all, we start with the story of Galla Placidia and her mausoleum. It's actually not her mausoleum, the small chapel in Ravenna that is known as her mausoleum. And I have to tell you that, I've done a lot of reading about it, both before and while writing this book. It does seem like it was not a mausoleum. It was built as a reliquary house. Maybe she intended to bury her son there, but I don't personally think so. It's a little fuzzy, but we remember it as a mausoleum. And I only go into this because I think the ways in which we remember, the ways in which we name things, obviously is really important. So this beautiful small chapel with a blue sky and flowers and stars and a very human looking Christ. And then the image of possibly St. Lawrence being burned on the grill. There's some debate about it. But again, it's just this, everyone should go to Ravenna, and you can go, we talk about it as well, you can go and see the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora, and you can go see the big tower of Theodoric. And there's a really good gelato shop I like there. But that mausoleum, that space in the mausoleum, I'll never forget going into it. And I hope that in our writing, we at least conveyed some of what it's like to go into this mystical space, absolutely Christian, absolutely pointing forwards in terms of the way that religion is going to develop in Italy, but 100% based on classical ideas of architecture and how you build and design sacred space. So it's this hybrid space that really matters. But also Galla Placidia is a woman. And we don't want to tell the story just of men. As I like to say, our best guess is 50% of all people during the Middle Ages were women. So you got to talk about them. But also she was there. She was in Rome in 410 in the sack of Rome, which often is where people start their story, but not us. She was involved in politics, often quite bloody politics leading up to that. She was taken as kind of a prisoner of war and then a diplomatic marriage to the Goths and taken to Spain. Her husband died. She got back to Rome. She married the emperor. She had a kid. She became the regent. And in this mid-5th century, this period in which allegedly Rome has fallen, she's building churches and writing letters to the emperor in Constantinople saying, hey, you guys are doing Christianity wrong. The Pope and I are going to tell you how to do it right. So it would have been a big surprise to her to hear that the Roman Empire had fallen. And so what I'm hoping we can do is not pretend that there wasn't change, but to understand two things. One, that this change is contingent, and in any given moment, humans make choices, constrained choices, but that things could turn out in different sorts of ways, that these things are not inevitable sort of historical forces moving time forward, but humans making choices. And two, that the ways we tell the story matter. So if I say the fall of Rome or the Dark Ages, I'm immediately drawn into this black hole, the center of this gravity pit of 700 years of a particular kind of storytelling. And I don't want to be in that gravity. I want to escape it. So instead, I can say there was decline in Roman authority in the far northwestern Europe. I can say that soldiers left, the legions left England. And although no one knew they weren't going to come back at the time, they in fact did not come back. And that's a change. We can look at evidence of a decrease in long distance trade or populations in cities. And I can say there's less trade in smaller cities without saying the fall of the Roman Empire, right? One thing is a true thing that I can just say. And the other thing is creating a narrative that places me in a particular tradition of narratives. And those are the kinds of choices I want us. And when I say us, I really mean us as historians, us as teachers, but also us as readers to be aware of.
And it's an interesting way of getting away from that narrative, that traditional narrative, which has been stuck in schools for
Yeah.
centuries, stuck in the way we watch television, the production of this era within the media. And I really like the idea, because you did bring Ravenna into the book so beautifully. But I
Thank you.
really like the idea of how you brought in the ideas of early globalization, the periphery, into the narrative, because it's not something that we've traditionally look at within this era. We tend, like you said, we fall into this gravity trap, the center, looking at Rome and not looking elsewhere. And by
Yeah.
looking at trade in the northwest, forces leaving England, we're starting to look at that periphery. So why did you think it was important to kind of bring in these ideas?
At all times during so we wanted to tell a history of Europe. Um, not to try to say we were telling, a global Middle Ages or just the Middle Ages. It's the European Middle Ages. But at all times, Europe is part of a bigger world. And sometimes again, sometimes there's more flow of ideas and peoples and things, and sometimes there's lesser to different places and different times. But there's always contact, and sometimes the contact is swift or slow. But, just we talk about this a lot in our early England chapter, because even the people who try to diminish the Dark Ages still often say, well, maybe there was a couple hundred years in early England, but where they have bishops arriving from Africa. And not only do bishops arrive from Africa, but nobody seems particularly surprised that they're African. They're not like, well, what's Africa? I've never heard of that. Like, oh, this is a bishop from Africa. That makes sense. They have garnets from India, right? They have lapis lazuli from Central Asia, from what, I don't know if it came from the what we call Afghanistan today, but certainly from Central Asia, right? These things are moving. So sometimes things move and sometimes people move, and sometimes it takes many generations for something to happen. But there is no point in which Europe is cut off from the world, is not part of the world, is not thinking about the world, and in which a lot of the world is thinking about Europe too.
And I've seen that throughout, and it's really nice to see these connections, particularly the inclusion of African history within this global, or this more Eurocentric narrative of the era, because it's not something that we traditionally make that connection with.
Well, yeah, and we kind of deliberately tried to pull the center of gravity a little bit south. A lot of the history of sort of the European Middle Ages is really French, English, and German. It was invented. This discipline was invented in 19th century universities in Germany, France, and England as kind of part of the building of nation state historical narratives. And that's a very complicated sentence I just said, with a whole other podcast kind of layered behind it. And but it's there, right? So we really wanted to pull south, and part of it is something like the Mediterranean, including Italy and Spain and southern France. And parts of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. They have more cities in times when other places don't have cities, but they're part of Europe. So if we try to write, so if we try to write these other places out because they're different than kind of the model, I would say that the problem is the model, not these other places.
And I really like that idea that the problem is the model, because
Right.
certainly here, and being a teacher in England, I do kind of see these narratives where we focus exclusively on that Anglo-Franco relationship, without really bringing anything else in until a pope pops up and declares a religious war.
That's
So
right.
it's a difficult thing to try and navigate as historians. But part of that,
well, models are hard, right? I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I know you have
no,
a
of
lot of
course.
other questions, but like models are hard. Right? So I just think about the ones that feudalism is the F word for medievalists, and we talk about that in the book. But like, there's never a moment in which there is a feudal system that works in the way that I was taught in middle school, with a pyramid with the king at the top and knights at the bottom, and sort of a king, duke, counts, barons, knights in this structure. It never existed. There are moments in which ideas like that exist in the Middle Ages, and medieval people are thinking about power in interesting ways, but that system never exists. But we get taught it when we're 12 because it's easy. And if we're a teacher and we're teaching 12-year-olds, trying to teach history to 12-year-olds, that's hard. Just like when we get taught physics, we get taught, models of the molecule that are two-dimensional concentric circles rather than complex 3D shapes spinning in space. And I understand that, but also we're not telling the truth. And that too is part of the work of the Bright Ages, is that we're trying to say, you can do 1,000 years in 300 pages and tell a different kind of story. And it will be a story that makes choices, that leaves things out. I mean, we cannot do 1,000 years in 300 pages. You can't do 1,000 years in 30,000 pages. All of these things are choices. But, we wanted to do it with kind of brevity and speed and hopefully an openness of the language that invites lots of different kinds of readers in, to show that it's possible. To show that you can, I don't know about 12-year-olds, but I know a lot of people who have given this book to their 14 and 15-year-olds who are interested in history and had them read it, as well as their 90 and 95-year-old parents and had them read it. And so that's really, I mean, that's part of the work on just a prose level, a sentence level, of trying to create different models for even when you're trying to talk pretty quickly and at a high overview, that it's possible.
Yeah, and I definitely, it's 100% possible. It challenges these conceptions that are created at school level. Like you said, I've been teaching that same feudal system, and it's infuriating as a teacher to know that it doesn't work like that. But still, you have to do that because that's the simplest way to explain it. But this just goes a long way to challenge misconceptions, or conceptions that start at uni because you've read something in a certain way, like you said, that was written in the 1960s. But a central theme that I see throughout it, and it's an area that I'm quite interested in, is the religious history. Religion is this guiding force throughout the medieval period, and you bring that throughout the pages of your book. But why is religion so important? Why do these popes become these guiding forces of the era?
Yeah. Both Matt and I in our scholarship do a lot of religious history. And we try to do religious history in the sense that we try to understand the overlapping and often conflicting experiences of what it meant to be religious within our time periods. And I'll say that my co-author is an intellectual historian and knows a lot more about what's happening at sort of the very high level. I'm an urban historian, and I really got interested in Venetians, who often are kind of the villains of history, stealing relics. And they are stealing relics, as did many people did. But I was interested in the ways in which they wrote about these various incidents and adventures and thefts and stories, thefts that didn't happen, that they lied about having done. And because I wanted to understand it within their own frame. It is a pathway into understanding how people view the world, but it's also another place to take apart big narratives, to not use the word Catholic pre-Reformation because it doesn't mean the same things. To understand that Christianity is always plural, not just that there are multiple sort of big forms of Christianities in the East and the West, but that in any place you look, you'll find radically different ideas of what it meant to be Christian. And the same is true with Judaism, and the same is true with Islam, all of which are medieval European religions. So this is really a major entry point for both of us as scholars into how to understand the medieval European world, and as a major way to understand the modern world too, but not in a I can't. I've had so many students who are like, oh, they were really religious back then. They must have not had a lot of sex or something, and that's just not true. They in fact had a lot of sex, and they liked it, and they wrote really dirty books about it, and they told really dirty stories about bishops seducing the Lord's wives, and but they also thought other things too at the same time, because that takes me back to the idea that they were human.
And I love those kind of stories that you insert as well, because like you said, it does make the story more human. It's those little interesting snippets of history which draw people in, which are engaging and tell you that, like you said, these medieval people were people. They were human. And one idea that I quite like is looking at the horrors of the church, the violence of the church. How does this peaceful a religion that professes to be peaceful deliver so much violence and horror upon the era?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's a place that places you as a historian in a complicated position. Because on the one hand, there is a whole contemporary right-wing movement, so not just sort of casually right-wing, but kind of far right movement that would like to say the Crusades are great and the Inquisition was great. And if it wasn't great, it was at least better than what the Muslims are doing, or and but on the other hand, there's an idea that religion is the source of all evil in the world and is just a smokescreen for violence. And so it places you in a complicated position. And we didn't want to erase the violence or make it seem like medieval Christians were particularly more violent than anyone else. I will say that from the first moment in Christian history, from when state violence was possible, Christian rulers used state violence and linked it to their religion. Sometimes more, sometimes less. There definitely is a moment around the First Crusade in which something exceptional and unusual happens. And we've been trying to figure out what that was and how for a very long time with I think a lot of success, a lot of really very good readings of our sources and trying to make sense of these things that happened and what was new and what was old there. And if you go to a conference of Crusades historians, you will see in any given year, 50% of them often seem to be on this question of why did this crusade happen and why did it turn out this way in the First Crusade. But it is certainly true that religion of all sorts can provide a narrative for justifying defining people as an other, sometimes in religious terms, on doctrinal terms, often in either racial or pre-racial terms. There's a lot of scholarship now around what they're calling race making in medieval Europe, which is to say ways of defining difference that, at least for me, and there are better people who can talk about this, but for me, in hindsight, it's clear that it's leading towards ideas of race, even if it's still not formed all the way in various periods. But race making and around difference, and sometimes, as with Jews, I'm Jewish, I guess I'll just say that with medieval Jews and modern Jews, that simultaneously doctrinal and racial, the othering of Jews is a particular problem that works in specific ways. So religion provides a tool for that. It also provides a tool for making different choices. And I mean, there's lots of places in the book we could talk about that. I like the example of King Louis IX, and people can look at this in the BBC History Today magazine, where he wrote about that. So I think that's what it's called. And at the same time as he's building Sainte-Chapelle, which is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And if then people should go to Paris and go to Sainte-Chapelle, and the entire walls are made of colored glass. It's just extraordinary. He was having Jewish law books burned in the Place de Grève. Just you might even be able to see it from the steps of Sainte-Chapelle if you look the right way. And that both of these are part of the story of medieval religion. Or another one when there's the story of kind of medieval Christians were intolerant and savage and banned books, and then we get the Renaissance and we get science, and that's good. And it is true that medieval people banned books, but the story we like to tell is in Paris in the 13th century, they banned teaching Aristotle. Complicated reasons why, but it's often that ban of Aristotle is often held up as a sign of the intolerance of medieval Christianity, and it was. But at the same time, down the road, Toulouse, another French city, their university says, hey, we're still teaching Aristotle. Leave Paris, come here. And that also is part of the story of medieval religion, that these are both equally part of the story of medieval religion. One place banning books, the other place using banning books to advertise their own services.
And it's great because we see France is almost this microcosm of the different cultures and opinions within Christianities, and it's a really great case study on how France can represent both sides of the argument within Christianity or Christianities. And you also talk about, sorry,
no, go on.
You also talk about Judaism, like you've mentioned. I find it really quite interesting that you bring Judaism and Islam into the medieval story of the Bright Ages. Why did you feel it was? I know you're Jewish,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
why
yeah,
did you think
yeah.
it was important to bring both of these into the story?
The most simplest answer is because they were there, because they're part of the story. It's the same reason that people ask us, why we include so many women. It's because 50% of the people were women. 50% were not Jewish, but there were Jews throughout the history of medieval Europe in different kinds of positions, sometimes more fraught, often quite peaceful. But even when peaceful, sort of constrained in different sorts of ways. There is no paradise of 20th century, 21st century sort of multiculturalism. We can, again, does that exist in the modern world? That's a different podcast. But there is no, medieval people are not thinking about difference in modern ways, even at our best selves, like our best ideas. They have different ideas, but there are Jews there the whole time. And the same thing with Islam. We have a chapter on the origins of Islam, which is one of the most extraordinary stories in world history. And it's also a story that a lot of people have written about, including in popular books aimed at English language audiences that are very accessible. There's lots of good stories on early Islam that have been told and are being told. So what we're trying to do in our chapter is two different things. One, we spend a lot of the book trying to undermine this narrative of an eternal clash of civilizations between, as it's been called, Islam and the West, which is both very fraught terms. But we want to say that's not true, and talk about the contested but coexistence within the early city of Jerusalem after the conquest, when a caliph prays outside the Holy Sepulchre, with the patriarch kind of overseeing the process. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone is happy and living and holding hands and singing Kumbaya together, but it does. They're also not killing each other all the time, and so it's worth doing that. But also to say that Islam is a medieval European religion. There is no point after about 700 in which there aren't Muslims who live in Europe, who are born in Europe, who think of themselves, if not as European, at least as Iberian or as Sicilian, or as multi-generational inhabitants of a place that we would recognize as Europe. There's just no story of medieval Europe without having Muslims living there, as just as much as anyone else is living there. So you have to tell that story.
And it is a fascinating story. In that chapter, I will implore anyone to go and read it, because it really builds a really nice picture of Europe within the age, with the idea of Islam built into it. It's a really great story to go and read and understand the period a little bit more. And there seems to be a lot of, like you said, with coexistence, but a transfer of knowledge, and a relationship which coexists in the context of knowledge quite peacefully. So would you say the Bright Ages is an era of peaceful knowledge transfer?
I mean, I don't know if I want to go on peaceful, but there is a lot of knowledge transfer. So first of all, there's a couple different things happening that are important. One goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, of this idea of Europe as existing in kind of a splendid isolation from which it will beat the Black Death, build big ships, and conquer the world. And sort of in the simplistic, that's just not true. They are part of the world, or at least the hemisphere, the whole time. They're part of the hemisphere the whole time. And they know it, and they understand that. There is a lot of transfer of knowledge, and it's complicated, like we open our chapter on Iberia with a monk from Cluny. Cluny is the great intellectual think tank of the period. It's sort of it founds franchises of monasteries all over Europe. It drives reform. It gets to pick the Pope eventually. It's a really big deal. And a guy from Cluny goes to Toledo, and his mission is to translate the Quran. I'll get the Quran translated. He doesn't know Arabic, but get it translated into Latin, which sounds like a great moment of multicultural sharing, right? Translate the holy book. And it is a point of multicultural contact that really matters. At the same time, he's doing it so that he can understand Islam more, he and his brethren, so that they can refute it and say why it's wrong, and not a true new revelation. So they're not working in a modern context of let's build harmony across faiths. They're building a context of we need to understand this faith so we can beat it. But at the same time, they do come to understand the other faith, and it does have an impact on them. We have a chapter that focuses around the great thinker. It's actually his birthday today, Moses Maimonides. It's March 30th. And as I understand, I just saw it on the internet earlier this morning, this is his birthday. So happy birthday to the great Maimonides. Maimonides was born in Iberia, so medieval European Jew. He spends a lot of his life in North Africa, including Cairo, being the head of the Jewish quarter in Cairo, but also the doctor to the great Sultan Saladin. So really, and then writing some of the most important works of philosophy of all time. His brother dies trying to trade from the east coast of Africa to the Indian Ocean. So there's yet another connection, and we have these amazing sources that tell us about them. But really the thing about that chapter is that we have people in Iran who are commenting on Aristotle. So there's the classical world, and also then innovating based on those commentaries. And that knowledge moves from Iran to Egypt, from Egypt to Iberia, from Iberia to France and Italy, back to Iberia, back across North Africa. And it's not like sending email. It's not overnight, but it is within 1 or 2 generations of these individuals doing this kind of thinking about this Greek text, and then what the translations of the Greek text and what it means for believers in these different religions in their own day. So St. Thomas Aquinas, how does Aristotle help? Maimonides dealing with the death of his brother and the presence of evil in the world, writes this book, The Guide for the Perplexed, in terms of explaining what God is and what God isn't. Very abstract stuff, not like first day, new student, let's sit down and read Maimonides stuff. But you can read it and you can think about it, again, as humans trying to understand their world, but also just watch the information flow, not just people's moving, but ideas about Aristotle moving thousands of miles across the world in the 11th, 12th, 13th century.
And yeah, again, if you see those international connections, and it's even great to see the transfer of knowledge and how it's affecting these different areas. And one area that you talk about in your book, and I find particularly interesting, is this introduction of China and China's interaction with the West or the world of Islam. How does that come about?
Well, again, that's a big topic that there are other people writing very good books about. So I want to be very clear that I'm not an expert in medieval China, and that there are experts in medieval China, and that you should seek them out. And we did, and we read them. And the story of China and Islam, that's in some ways the story of the Silk Road, add in Buddhism, and you have the story of the Silk Road. Medieval Europe is on the edge of the Silk Road the whole time. Silk moves, ideas move, people move, the whole time. It does intensify, though, in the era of the Mongolian Empire, for a lot of reasons, that the ways in which the Mongolian Empire across Central Asia and into China and into Western Asia and Southwestern Asia create kind of some shared systems. They make it a little easier to travel. They make it very profitable to travel. They make it politically and necessary to make contacts across. So we look at these friars moving out of the West and heading into Central Asia and sort of Northeast Asia to meet with the great Khan Mohe, sending him a letter from the Pope saying, you must convert or you'll go to hell. And the Pope, the Mongol Khan's like, well, you must convert or I'll come burn your city down. And, nothing happens. There's also lots of hopes of alliances and collaboration and such things. But the narrative, in every chapter, we're trying to undo a narrative. And the narrative here is that the West had no contact with the East, and these are, again, problematic terms, until the Crusades. And then when the Mongols come, they finally discover China, and they make contact across these great distances. And we would like instead to say that it's an intensification. When these Franciscan friars show up at the court of the Khan, no one is saying, who are these people? I've never heard of Christians before. Instead, they're saying, oh, they're a slightly different kind of Christian than the 50 other Christians that are all around us. Let's get one of them who speaks Hungarian to do the translation so that we can make it right. They have someone at their court who speaks Hungarian, ready to go. That there are these connections already pre-exist, and sometimes they intensify and change in meaning and new factors appear, but that it doesn't just come out of nowhere. Marco Polo doesn't come out of nowhere. He comes out of a long tradition of Venetians. I'm an expert in Venice in particular, traveling into the Eastern Mediterranean, accessing trade goods from as far east as they can go, and probably traveling pretty far inland pretty early on. Just does a source survive? Does a story survive that gets us there before a particular period? That might not happen, but Venetians are going to the Eastern Mediterranean, and at least some of them aren't stopping if they can find a safe way through.
And that's absolutely fascinating that they are trying to make that journey there, and they are making that journey. And I really like that phrase, intensification. I think it's the best descriptor of that relationship.
We don't want to be accused of saying nothing ever changes, because things change all the time. And we don't want to say it because it's not true, accusations notwithstanding. We don't want to say it because it's not true. We just want to rewrite some of the equally not true narratives of isolation and lack of contact, which are also just not true.
And it's interesting you also bring the Venetians into it, because the Venetians are partially responsible for one of the most disastrous or important events in this medieval period. 1204, with the fall of Constantinople, the fall of New Europe, or not New Europe, New Rome, the fall of New Rome. Well, how is this a particularly important event in this period? And is it a problematic term to say that it is the fall of New Rome equally as the fall of Rome is problematic?
I would say so. So you've asked me a good question. I have to tell you that every time we talk about the Fourth Crusade, I made Matt write the first draft. And the reason I made Matt write the first draft is that my first book is entirely on the First Crusade. The Fourth Crusade. The fourth one. All of my scholarly articles are about Venice, often about crusading. And I have spent a really large part of my adult life thinking about this question. So it's a place where summary is a challenge for me. In 1204, right, a group of French crusaders and Venetian crusaders pretty accidentally end up conquering the city of Constantinople. And having done so, they say, hey, this is the will of God. Now I've got a Latin Empire. We're going to reconnect with Rome. The Pope says, hey, that's great. And then it all falls apart in some ways within a year, although a version of the new dynasty that comes from the Counts of Flanders and Constantinople does hang on into the city until the 1260s. So that's one story. If it's the fall of New Rome, it is then immediately restored by a guy who takes the name Constantine, and not by accident. And there's another Paleologoi, this last dynasty that lasts from 1260 to 1453. So that's 200 years. There is a story that, Byzantium would have held off the Ottomans if not for the Fourth Crusade. I actually think that story is nonsense, in part because they had no boats. Like, the reason that the Fourth Crusade happens is that the Venetians had ships and the Greeks had no ships. And that put them in a strategic, they were having problems anyway, but it's hard to know how things would have turned out had something else not happened, right? There are lots of moments. In the restoration of Greek control of Constantinople, the Greeks ally with the city of Genoa that more or less provides them with a fleet. And Genoa does this because they want to undermine Venice. But both Genoa and Venice are part of Europe. And we can't pretend just because Genoa is a very different place than, I don't know, Glasgow, or, a Welsh castle, or, a city, I don't know, actually it's not that different than, I was going to say a city in Norway, but it's actually not that different than cities in Norway in important ways. Genoa is an unusual and interesting place, but, then Genoa, and so Western Catholic Europe, although I'm using the word Catholic, is just as much a part of putting these Greeks back on the throne in Constantinople as anyone else. I think it's fair to say that there's 500 years of relative instability around Constantinople, but also 500 years is a long time to hold on before the wave of the Ottomans come. There's a great British historian of the Crusades named Stephen Runciman, one of the most famous historians of the Crusades of all times, and he wrote this very important 3-volume series on the history of the Crusades. And I think about him a lot because he lived and fought through World War II. He had seen the horrors of World War II. And he writes about the Fourth Crusade, and he calls it, the greatest disaster in all of human history. And I just think we have to reject that kind of narrative. I think we really have to say that it was a disaster for the people who lost the war. There was definitely multiple days of plundering in the ways that when cities are captured, it is a bad time to be a civilian, and we don't want to pretend it's not. There was a huge extraction of wealth and art out of Constantinople and sent to the West. But of course, a lot of that art had been extracted from other places to bring to Constantinople. So it's a complicated narrative. It is dramatic and it is unexpected. And it does then change the ways in which people like Pope Innocent III, this very important pope in the early 13th century, and his successors and rulers are talking about their project. It means that Venice starts claiming itself to be, in some ways, the Roman Empire. What they really say is they claim to be the lords of 1/4 and 1/2 of 1/4 of the Roman Empire. So it's because they have contracts because they're merchants, right? So it has enormous impact on how people talk and think about themselves. It has big geopolitical and economic implications. But I also think it's not the greatest disaster ever to befall humans in all of history, and we have to walk a line between that.
And it's such a fascinating period, and you talked about this, how it's not one of the major disasters. I really enjoy how you challenge these narratives, these traditional narratives.
I mean, it's a disaster if you're one of the 3 emperors named Alexius, one after another. 1204 is a very bad year for you. It's a very bad year. And if you are a civilian in the city of Constantinople and your home is burned and your family members are killed, and maybe and maybe if you're a woman, you're raped, and maybe a family member is, right. Being in a conquered city is terrible. It's terrible. And we shouldn't look away from that kind of horror. But to hold it up as different than other moments of cities being ransacked and pillaged and other states falling, I think that's what we have to challenge.
Yeah,
there's a guy named Nicetas. There's a guy named Nicetas Choniates. I told you I couldn't be short on this one.
Yeah, that's all right.
Who was there. He was an advisor to the last of the Alexes in particular. He was there. He wrote a very important history of the period. And he has this lament in which he talks about the conquerors putting a prostitute on the throne of the patriarchs and raping nuns and burning everything to the ground. And I don't know about the prostitute on the throne of the patriarchs, but certainly there was widespread torture and rape and pillage that did happen. But what's always been striking about me is that during that period, according to himself, Choniates was hiding. He was in hiding, so he didn't see anything. And when he leaves the city, he's in a big line of people leaving the city, and some Franks come up and they pull a girl out of the train, and they're going to take her into a house and assault her. And some Venetians come up and say, "Hey, you can't do that." And they take her back, and they drive the Franks away. So this is the eyewitness part of what Choniates experiences is that nuanced story, right, of terrible violence and real threat and real destruction and personal fear, but also people making different kinds of choices and the worst thing not always happening at all times. So it is a messy, terrible, because all wars and all conquests are terrible, human story.
And yet again, I've really enjoyed how you brought that human side into it, and he's a particularly fascinating character. And another,
he's not in our book, sadly, but he's in my other books. My other book's the other book I did not write in a way to try to be accessible to 15 to 95-year-olds, but yeah, some people might read it.
Another particularly fascinating character attached to this Fourth Crusade, and he is my favorite pope. It's Innocent III. How important is Innocent III? Because he seems to have such a large amount of influence on the Bright Ages.
Sure. We try to shy away often from the sort of the great men doing great things narrative of history. But there certainly are great men and women who do great things and who have, as individuals, real impacts on how history develops. And I would say that Innocent III is one of them. He's pretty young when he becomes a pope, which is different. He's the benefit. He doesn't come out of nowhere, right? He comes out, I mentioned Cluny a few minutes ago. He comes out of a century of reform, both sort of legalistic reform and intellectual reform and theological reform, redefining the role of the Pope, and also political reform. He's got the tools of the Crusades. He's taking power after Crusades have already been wielded in various kinds of ways against enemies of the Pope, or against, these earlier examples of what event later will become known as the Italian or the Papal Crusades. There are some earlier examples. He's got a lot of tools that other popes didn't have. But he also seems to, he's from an elite Italian family. He's got a legal background, and he's got a very competent administration. And he has a set of ideas about what the Pope should be, and also where the world is in time, by which I mean he does seem to be shaped by, and I should drag Matt on somehow. He's really an expert in this, shaped by kind of apocalyptic theory of looking for where the end is coming and where he is living on that timeline. And so when something like the conquest of Constantinople happens in 1204, he sees it as a sign, oh, we're getting much closer to the end now. This is a big deal. The next thing that'll happen is, with the Eastern Roman Empire's resources, now we'll take back Jerusalem, and then we'll do this and we'll do that. And then here comes the book of Revelation. And then a year later, that doesn't happen. And so then he has to rethink, well, what did I misread? How did I get it wrong? So he has real power. He has administrative power. He has legal power, and he has ideas about who he is and where the world is that really comes together. And then he has enormous challenges. He has continued failures of crusades to the east. The Fourth Crusade is, I just think it's really important to emphasize that in April of 1204 and in the months that followed as news trickled west, the narrative was not, oh, this crusade, the disaster. The narrative was, this is the greatest crusade since the first one. We've taken Constantinople. We're going to reunify the churches. Everything's going to be great. It isn't what happened, but that's the story that they're telling in those first 6 months to a year. And we have sources, again, like it's knowable. They write letters. We have some of them. We don't have a lot of them, but if you have 6 of them, there are 6 identical letters by Pope Innocent that he sends out. And if you've got 6 of them, he probably sent out 60. So we can see this in the sources, but it goes badly. He's got heretics in the south of France. It goes badly. He's trying to figure out, what it means to have a church in a way that didn't exist before, in which everyone is trained kind of the same way and practices and devotional beliefs are the same way. So he pulls together the great and powerful of his world in this Fourth Lateran Council in 1214. And he and again, I say he, but I mean him and his administration. It's like when you talk about any political leader, right? There's a whole team of people try to pass a set of canon laws to stabilize what it means to be a Christian in that era. And it includes things like universal confession. And in the past, before that, so we're 12, if we take, which we shouldn't, but if we take the life of Jesus as 0, and we're in 1214, that's a lot of Christian history in which people did not confess their sins every year. And that means that the local priests often have no idea what people believe and often have no idea what's going on. And because to confess a sin, you have to understand what sin is, and understand what sin is, you have to be educated in a church. You have to be educated. And so there's a whole infrastructure that builds up around it. So I think you can't understate the importance of Innocent III and the world that he lived in on his impact on this period of history, often in quite destructive ways, of launching wars both in Europe and outside, but certainly also pushing intellectual and legal development that in their own ways are building universities and are creating places where people write books and learn things and create art and do all the other stuff that we claim to like, at the same time as terrible violence in the south of France against in the Albigensian Crusade and against so-called theoretical heretics.
And the Albigensian Crusade is horrible, and it's a real moment in European history where that power of the church is demonstrated, but it's also very hard.
Or the power of a church, the power of one idea of what it means to wield power and think about religion in that moment, right? It's not, there are a lot of people who also understand themselves as Christian who are appalled at the violence and who say so at the time. And sometimes they say so, in formal state chronicles, more they say so in, poems written in Provençal, in the language of the place that's being sacked, which I do not read, but I've read some translations, or I've read them in Latin, or I've read them in French. But and if there's 4 poems talking about how terrible this is, that were written down, think about how many were being recited orally that we don't have, right? I mean, there's both. We can't decide that Simon de Montfort and his violence, is the true face of medieval Christianity, and the guy criticizing him is somehow doesn't count. They're both medieval Europeans. And if one strain is more dominant at one moment or has more power than a moment, we can assess that and we can talk about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the idea of churches and Christianities, like you've touched on before, play out within this region.
If there's one thing that people who are interested in religious history, medieval religious history, take away from our conversation, that would be it. If I could, I have 50 things I'd rather, but if there's one, I'd like them to understand them as Christianities. And just because someone says we are the church and we have the power and we are Orthodox and we get to choose what's correct, doesn't mean that we have to take that at face value. And they're making an argument.
And I particularly like that argument. I like the idea of the Bright Ages and looking at the influence of certain different events and people. And I want to look at one final event, and that is the Black Death. The Black Death. It leaves such a huge influence and mark on medieval Europe. But how did this affect these medieval people, and what was their reaction to it?
Yeah, it's definitely a chapter that we would have written differently in 2019 than we wrote in 2020. I think the first draft of that showed up in the summer of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, maybe the early fall, but I think the summer. And we were able to be outside, but we still weren't really gathering, at least in the U.S. And it's very different writing about a global pandemic when you're living in one. And we talk about the writing of history. It happens in its own context. The writing of history happens in context. Stephen Runciman writing after World War II. I'm no Sir Stephen Runciman. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not claiming, but the fact that we wrote this during a pandemic, just things like we couldn't go visit each other. We had to do everything remotely. We couldn't go to our libraries and check out books, particularly in the early stage before they kind of figured out ways around that. I think that the impact of the first few decades of the second plague pandemic in Europe. So you may have noticed I used very careful language there, right? The Black Death we're talking about in the 1340s, the arrival of bubonic plague in Italy. New scholarship by Monica Green, we talk about this in the book, has really pushed our understanding of the spread of that back to the early 13th century in the mountains of the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia. We find it in Baghdad in the 1250s. We find it, so over 100 years before kind of we understood the origins of this pandemic, we're now finding it. And part of that, this is not happy thought, but pandemics last for centuries, right? The second plague pandemic lasts for centuries. So we're 3 years into the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope we make it not in centuries, but I don't think that story is not over. That's and there are more twists and turns in that story, as there were in the story of the Black Death. When 40% of the population dies, that's just unthinkable. It's unthinkable. And the ways in which it affects the economy and state powers and work, whether it's people making more money because of concentration of capitals or peasants trying to be forced into labor so that they can't ask, when there's fewer peasants, they could ask for more wages. So the state passes laws that they can't ask for more wages. Then they rise up and try to kill people, and then they get suppressed. It's not, there's generations of violence and chaos and reorganization of society that happens as a result of this wave of death. One thing that I think is easier to teach now than it was 10 years ago or even 3 years ago is that medieval people weren't stupid. They were understanding their world to the best as they could. They had ideas about contagion. They had ideas about bad air, about airborne viruses, right? Or not viruses, but airborne contagion. They had ideas about quarantine. They did not understand, insects on rodents as a vector to transmit blood-borne pathogens. That is not a medieval sentence. But they really did think very hard about their world, and they tried to make sense of it in ways that kind of worked for them, that had reasonable theory behind it. They also panicked. They also went into extremes of religious activity and extremes of secular activity. But again, I think it's easier to see those extreme reactions, for me anyway, with a little more nuance and understanding, having watched the global reaction to COVID. And I don't know how you feel about it. I certainly know that the UK response has been as complicated as the US response. But we have seen everything from churches preaching there is no COVID to people, saying, I don't care if I get COVID, I'm going to go to this party. I'm going to go to this festival anyway and, be around lots of people, and to people locking themselves in their home for 3 years, right? We've seen everything. People saying, trust the science, to people saying the science is evil and is going to, infect you with some other disease or something, right? I mean, we've seen everything. And so I think it's easier for us to understand, and I understood it intellectually, but I understand it better emotionally now, how this kind of uncontrollable disease event moves through a human population and reveals the cracks and fissures and also resiliencies and strengths of that population. And that's really how I look at the Black Death. Is it's, as it goes from human to human, it's like connect the dots. Here's how society works, and we can see it and we can think about it in that way.
And I certainly try to echo those thoughts, that having lived through a pandemic, it's now easier to understand the reactions and the connections that were present within the Black Death, or the second plague pandemic, as you call it. So it's
I'm really interested in how that's like in 15 years, right? In an introductory college level or advanced high school level class, I'm really interested in how the Black Death gets taught, both because the science and then the non-scientific scholarship is so different. And I taught something that wasn't true my entire career until Monica Green said, hey, you all are 100 years too late. So we have to, it wasn't that I was lying. I taught the best story I knew, but so that's going to change on an academic level. But then, all the people who are 5 now, who are 10 now, as they enter advanced, I just think it's going to be a very different experience.
Yeah, no, I've certainly taken that from my own teaching experience, where teaching to students who have literally grown up within a pandemic, their understanding of plagues and pandemics is very different to what mine was when I was learning that same experience.
Yeah, so for sure.
I can see that there will probably be a few plague experts in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, I know this is a difficult question to pinpoint, but just for the benefit of our listeners, when do you think the Bright Ages begin, and roughly, and I'm going to use the phrase roughly because it's hard to pinpoint anything.
Yeah. So we actually we begin in the 430s with the construction of this mausoleum, and in general the life of Galla Placidia. That's where we like to begin. Certainly there are things that are changing in the 5th century that are worth noting, and it's a reasonable point. If you're going to have political eras, you're going to have a page 1. You're going to have to put something on page 1. But I would like to emphasize that it's arbitrary. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of other choices that could be made. With the end, again, there have been lots of different places to look. I tend to look at it kind of as a continuum, that we get people like Petrarch who are saying, we're in a new period, guys. We're in the Renaissance now. So that marks a kind of intellectual shift, if not one that necessarily holds up to the evidence. There's definitely changes that happen economically in the 15th century, in part because of the plague pandemic, but also in part because of new technologies and global transportation. I definitely think the connections to the Atlantic world start to shift a lot of things. And the Reformation, the fall of Constantinople, which does end the Roman Empire, at least in that Roman Empire, although Roman empires continue in Europe and in Moscow. but the rise of the Ottoman Empire is a real reshaping of things, and the Reformation is a reshaping of things. It forces kind of inchoate divisions within Christianities to become more defined, and then to get armies and then to go to war with each other. So that changes. So as we move into the 1400s and 1500s, we start to see some pretty big changes. But the latest anecdote that we talk about in our book is in the 16th century. It's this debate in Valladolid, Spain. I think I said that right. Between a kind of a newfangled humanist thinker and a very medieval Dominican thinker. And the newfangled humanist thinker, the man of science, the man who, sort of we might tout as the hallmark of modernity, which we would say is a good thing. He's saying it's a debate about what to do with the indigenous populations of the Americas in Spain. And he's saying that, erase them, wipe them out, forcibly convert them. Their culture has no value. Let's totally just, use them as slaves. But they're not really humans at all. And the medieval person is saying, not in a 21st century abolitionist framework, right? He's not a good modern guy. I don't want to pretend that, but in this very medieval way, saying, we have to understand these people as humans with souls, and we need to engage them as humans and be humane to them. Again, in a medieval way. And so even in the 16th century moment, even in the expansion of the European sphere of influence and power into the broader world, and the rise of the age of colonization and imperialism, we still see the continuum of the Middle Ages live on.
And that particular moment in your book, I think it's a great reflection of the different ideas that were present and the way ideas were moving. And that was a really nice explanation of where it begins and where it could possibly end as well, to help our listeners.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But it's arbitrary. We're just making choices because we have to have a first page and we have to have a last page, right? We're just making choices, and the choices have implications. And if people want to criticize us for those choices, it's fair game. Come, write a different story. I'm eager to read it.
Yeah. And I
really am. I'm eager to read it. I'm eager to read it.
Well, I definitely encourage other people to go and write their own then. But firstly, to read this one, because this is really fantastic. Now, final fun question for you, as we do for all our guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. Which 3 characters from your book would you like to have dinner with, and why?
Yeah, well, I don't know that they'd all get along, but the first one is Maimonides. I don't feel like I'm worthy. He's so important, and he's important in my sort of personal family traditions as one of the great Jewish thinkers of all time. But there's something about his personality that comes through in some of the survivors that I don't know. I would like to sit there and feed him a good dinner while he tells me things for several hours. More entertaining is Marie de France. We didn't really talk about her, but we have a chapter on Marie de France and sort of court culture, and in general, women as intellectual creators in the High Middle Ages. Talk about Hildegard von Bingen, and I'm sure Hildegard would be great. But Marie de France, she just has this kind of joyous. Her writing is just. I would like to ask her. I have a lot of questions about the stories she's telling and who she's telling them for, and the choices she makes, and there's fun things like werewolves and fairies and other things. It's good. And then. She doesn't actually, well, I don't know. It's a tough choice for the third one. I guess in terms of who I'd really, sitting down for dinner sounds like we're friends, and I don't know that I want to be friends with many of these people. But I have a lot of questions we don't talk about him in our book, but I have a lot of questions for Doge Enrico Dandolo. We've been talking about the Fourth Crusade. This guy in his 90s who leads a crusade. I just have a lot of questions, and I'd like some answers. So maybe it's a little less sitting down for dinner and more of a journalist doing an interview. But if I could get him on the record on a few issues, I'd really like that.
And to be 19 leading the crusade, I'd sure have a lot of questions for him as well.
90 and blind, right? But is there on the boats. He's not, running up the walls, but he's there on the boats. I have a lot of questions.
And if our listeners would like to go away and read more about some of the topics within the book, or more about some of the topics that we've spoken about today, what would you recommend that they go away and have a read of?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess what I'd like them to do is look at the further reading section in in our book. But I will say that this is a pretty great moment for hopefully smart books written about the Middle Ages for a general audience. There's a lot of really, really great stuff. I think Kat Jarman's new book, The River Kings, on the Vikings, and thinking about the Vikings kind of relocating the center. I mean, again, England is important in the history of the Viking world, but it's just one piece, and it's not the biggest piece. And so, England, I think it's sometimes because English people are writing English books, or these Anglophones, if it's Americans, we get a little over focused on the British story of the Vikings and not the Ukrainian. I mean, the story of Kiev. And so I think The River Kings is great. Also, the book that I just read, I even have it here somewhere. I'm going to make sure I get it right. This book, Fierce Appetites, by Elizabeth Boyle. She's an expert in medieval Irish literature, and it's a memoir about the death of her father, about parenting. There's a lot of sex in it. There's also a lot of sex in her sources, and I think it is just an enormously inviting way to think about how medieval people talked about their world and the places in which they connect. And then finally, we have a further reading section in the Bright Ages for each chapter. We worked hard on it. It is short. Each section is short. There are dozens more books we could have listed, but at each point we tried to direct the reader towards things that are available in English that they could read about any of the topics we cover. And we really hope that when people read the Bright Ages, it's a first step, not a final word.
And it's a great further reading section, and I like your concept behind it, and I hope more books start to adopt a similar concept, because it's a great tool for students, but it's also a great tool for casual history readers who want to go out and find more on their topics. Now, finally,
this is the thing historians don't know, is that people love history. People love reading history. We just have to give it to them. We have to give it to them in a way that is inviting. That's really it. Sorry. You were gonna close with an eloquent comment, but I'm too excited about history.
Well, I was actually going to ask them to direct them towards your book, which is a great piece of accessible history.
Well, if you just Google the Bright Ages, you will find it available in all reasonable online and in-person bookstores. I'm a big fan of local bookstores, but buy it wherever you like. You can find more from me at davidmperry.com, and that's a great way to find out where I am and find my social media handles. I'm very active on Twitter and have email and things like that, and I'll hope to hear from some of your listeners.
And I'll make sure all your social media links are in the description below, and a link to go and get the Bright Ages, because it is truly a fantastic book. If you want to challenge the conceptions that or misconceptions that you have to the medieval period, it is a fantastic read, and I breezed through it really quite quickly. I couldn't put the book down, so I really recommend people to go away and grab themselves a copy. Well, thank you very much for coming on, David. I really, really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Jackson. It was great. Yep.
And for all our listeners, if you enjoyed listening to me and David, please make sure to leave a like and a review. It really helps more people to learn more about history. And if you really, really want to, maybe you can give it a share so more people can get more people can have a listen to David impart his masterful knowledge of the medieval period. Thank you, guys.